I'm Daniel Ruck. I'm a professor of history in the Department of History at the University of Ottawa, and I'm really glad to be part of this effort to create videos of people reading from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission executive summary. I'll be reading pages 200 to 202, a section entitled Language and Culture. In a study of the impact of residential schools, the Assembly of First Nations noted in 1994 that, quote, language is necessary to define and maintain a worldview. For this reason, some First Nations elders to this day will say that knowing or learning the native language is basic to any deep understanding of a First Nations way of life, to being a First Nations person. For them, a First Nations world is quite simply not possible without its own language. For them, the impact of residential schools silencing their language is equivalent to a residential school silencing their world. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples similarly noted the connection between Aboriginal languages and what is called a distinctive worldview rooted in the stories of ancestors and the environment. The Royal Commission added that Aboriginal languages are a tangible emblem of group identity that can provide the individual a sense of security and continuity with the past. Maintenance of the language and group identity has both a social, emotional, and spiritual purpose. Residential schools were a systematic government-sponsored attempt to destroy Aboriginal cultures and languages and to assimilate Aboriginal peoples so that they no longer existed as a distinct peoples. English, and to a far lesser degree French, were the only languages permitted to be used in most schools. Students were punished, often severely, for speaking their own languages. Michael Sillett, a former student of the Northwest River Residential School in Newfoundland and Labrador, told the commission, quote, children at the dorm were not allowed to speak their mother tongue. I remember several times when other children were slapped or had their mouths washed out for speaking their mother tongue, whether it was Inuktitut or Inu Aimun. Residents were admonished for just being native, unquote. As late as the 1970s, students at schools in northwestern Ontario were not allowed to speak their language if they were in the presence of a staff member who could not understand that language. Conrad Burns, whose father attended the Prince Albert School, named this policy for what it was. It was a cultural genocide, he said. People were beaten for their language. People were beaten because they followed their own ways, unquote. Rights to culture and language and the need for remedies for their loss have long been recognized in international law. They are specifically acknowledged in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has recognized the critical state of Aboriginal languages. Article 8.1 of the Declaration recognizes that, quote, Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Article 8.2 provides that, quote, states shall provide effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for any form of forced assimilation or integration, unquote. The Declaration also includes specific recognition of the right to revitalize and transmit Aboriginal languages in Article 13.1, which recognizes that, quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. Article 14 provides for educational language rights of the type that Canadians already know and experience with respect to Anglophone and Francophone minorities. Article 14.1 provides similarly that, quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages, in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. And Article 14.3 provides, quote, states shall, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, take effective measures in order for Indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access when possible to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. Article 16 provides that Indigenous peoples, quote, have the right to establish their own media in their own language and have access to all forms of non-Indigenous media without discrimination. And that states, quote, shall take effective measures to ensure that state-owned media duly reflect Indigenous cultural diversity. The attempt to assimilate students by denying them access to and respect for their Aboriginal languages and culture often meant that students became estranged from their families and communities. Agnes Mills, a former student at All Saints Residential School in Saskatchewan, told the Commission her story. Quote, and one of the things that residential school did for me, I really regret, is that it made me ashamed of who I was. And I wanted to be white so bad. And the worst thing I ever did was, I was ashamed of my mother. That honorable woman, because she couldn't speak English. She never went to school, and she told us that we used to go home to her on Saturdays, and they told us that we couldn't talk Gwich'in to her, and she couldn't, communicate. And my sister was the one that had the nerve to tell her, we can't talk Lushe to you. They told us not to. Unquote. Mary Couchen, formerly a student at the residential school at Fort Alexander in Manitoba and Lebret in Saskatchewan, had a similar interaction with her family. Quote, and I look at my dad, I looked at my mom, I looked at my dad again. You know what? I hated them. I just absolutely hated my own parents. Not because I thought they abandoned me, I hated their brown faces. I hated them because they were Indians. So I looked at my dad and I challenged him and I said, from now on we only speak English in this house. I said to my dad. And you know, when in a traditional home where I was raised, the first thing that we were always taught was to respect your elders and never to challenge them. And here I was 11 years old and I challenged my dad, and my dad looked at me and I thought he was going to cry. In fact, his eyes filled up with tears. He turned to my mom and he says, then I guess we'll never speak to this little girl again. I don't know her. Some survivors refused to teach their own children their Aboriginal languages and cultures because of the negative stigma that had come to be associated with them during their school years. This has contributed significantly to the fragile state of Aboriginal languages in Canada today. Many of the almost 90 surviving Aboriginal languages in Canada are under serious threat of extinction. In the 2011 census, 14.5% of the Aboriginal population reported that their first language learned was an Aboriginal language. In the previous 2006 census, 18% of those who identified as Aboriginal had reported an Aboriginal language as their first language learned. And a decade earlier, in the 1996 census, the figure was 26%. This indicates nearly a 50% drop in the 15 years since the last residential school closed. There are, however, variations among Aboriginal peoples. 63.7% of Inuit speak their Indigenous language compared to 22.4% of First Nations peoples, and only 2.5% of Métis people. Some languages are close to extinction because they only have a few remaining speakers of the great-grandparent generation. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, lists 36% of Canada's Aboriginal languages as being critically endangered, in the sense that they are used only by great-grandparents' generation. 18% are severely endangered in the sense they're used by the great-grandparent and grandparent generations, and 16% are definitely endangered in the sense that they are used by the parental and the two previous generations. The remaining languages are all vulnerable. If the preservation of Aboriginal languages does not become a priority both for governments and for Aboriginal communities, then what the residential schools failed to accomplish will come about through a process of systematic neglect. Language rights. In interpreting Aboriginal and treaty rights under Section 35(1) of the Constitution Act, 1982, the Supreme Court of Canada has stressed the relation of those rights to the preservation of distinct Aboriginal cultures. The Commission concurs. The preservation of Aboriginal languages is essential and must be recognized as a right. Call to action. We call upon the federal government to acknowledge that Aboriginal rights include Aboriginal language rights.